My family's farmland was everything. Our blood, our sweat, our survival. But the HOA thought they could steal it. They were wrong. I grew up on 3,200 acres of farmland that my family had owned for generations. To most people, it might just look like fields of dirt and grass, but to me, it was everything. This land held my childhood memories, my family's blood and sweat, and the history of every harvest that kept us alive. My father worked this land until his last days, and when he passed it down to me, I made him a promise. I would protect it no matter what. For years, life was peaceful. I worked the farm, watched the seasons change, and carried on the legacy of my family. That is, until one strange letter showed up in my mailbox. The envelope carried the logo of the Homeowners Association, the HOA from a nearby community. Confused, I tore it open, expecting something routine. Instead, my blood ran cold. The letter boldly claimed that part of my farmland now belonged to the HOA. At first, I laughed out loud. How could they possibly believe they had any authority over my family's land? It sounded absurd, like some kind of prank. I tossed the letter aside, thinking it was nothing more than a mistake. But weeks later, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Surveyors, men I had never seen before, were walking across my property. They were placing orange flags in the ground, marking invisible lines across my fields. I stormed out and demanded to know what they were doing. Their response left me speechless. "We're preparing the land for community development," one of them said casually, as if he had every right to be there. "Community development?" I snapped, "This is private property. You're trespassing." But they didn't flinch. They carried on, as though my words meant nothing. That's when the horrifying truth began to sink in. The HOA wasn't bluffing. Somehow, they had filed fraudulent paperwork and illegally sold all 3,200 acres of my farmland to a development company. I could hardly breathe. My family's entire legacy, my livelihood, was being stolen out from under me. I immediately hired a lawyer, one of the toughest in the county. From the very first meeting, he warned me that this wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had deep pockets, a team of attorneys, and a reputation for bullying anyone who stood in their way. Still, I knew I had no choice. This was my land, my family's legacy. Losing wasn't an option. The fight dragged on for months, and it was brutal. Every few weeks, I'd find myself sitting in a courtroom, staring across the aisle at smug HOA board members. They never smiled, but the way they carried themselves said it all. They thought they'd already won. Their lawyers kept filing motion after motion, drowning us in paperwork. They claimed my deeds were outdated, that my property boundaries were unclear, that I lacked the proper documentation to prove ownership. It was maddening. My family's deeds stretched back more than a century. I had records, surveys, and legal descriptions dating all the way to my great-grandfather. But the HOA's strategy wasn't to win with facts. Their strategy was to bury me in legal fees, to make the fight so expensive and exhausting that I'd finally give up. But I didn't give up. Instead, I doubled down. Every night, after long days of working the farm, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of boxes filled with documents. I went through every deed, every tax record, every map. Dust covered my hands, but with each page, I grew more determined. And then I found it. Proof. Buried deep in the records was a set of documents that directly contradicted the HOA's claims. Not only did they fail to have any rights to my land, but their so-called proof was a fabricated mess. Piece by piece, I uncovered their lies. The next time we walked into court, the energy shifted. My lawyer laid out the evidence, one document at a time. He didn't just prove that my land was mine. He exposed the HOA for filing fraudulent claims. You could see the color drain from their faces. The smirks disappeared. The board members who had once looked untouchable suddenly looked like cornered animals. And then came the ruling. The judge slammed the gavel and declared that the HOA had acted illegally. My land was mine again, undisputed, unshakable, and forever protected. I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in months. But just when I thought the story was over, I discovered something even more satisfying. As part of the court process, I gained access to some of the HOA's financial records. That's when I learned the truth. In order to fund their endless lawsuits against me, They had secretly mortgaged several of their own community homes. They were so confident in crushing me that they gambled with their own assets. And because they lost, they couldn't pay their debts. The properties went into foreclosure and were scheduled for auction. I couldn't believe the irony. The very people who tried to take my legacy were about to lose their own homes. On the day of the auction, I showed up quietly. I didn't announce myself. I simply raised my hand when the bidding began. One by one, I purchased the homes. And with each winning bid, a weight lifted from my shoulders. By the end of the day, I legally owned every single home that the HOA members lived in. The tables had turned completely. The same people who had threatened me, mocked me, and dragged me through court now had no choice but to rent their houses from me. I could have raised the rent. I could have evicted them just to prove a point. But I didn't. I didn't need to. Instead, I kept the rent fair, but I made sure they understood the situation. You try to take away my family's legacy. I told them, now I own yours. The look in their eyes said everything. They hated it, but there was nothing they could do. Justice had been served, and it was a justice far sweeter than anything a courtroom alone could deliver. To this day, I still farm my land. I wake up early, breathe the fresh air, and work the same soil my father once walked. And every time I drive past those houses, I can't help but smile. The HOA thought they could bury me, but in the end, they buried themselves. Here's the truth. Justice doesn't always come fast. Sometimes it feels like the fight will break you before it saves you. But when it does arrive, when the dust finally settles and you realize you've won, it tastes sweeter than you could imagine. And for me, victory wasn't just keeping my farm. Victory was knowing that every single day, the people who tried to destroy me now live under the roof of the man they couldn't beat. Because justice doesn't just mean survival. Sometimes, justice means turning the tables and winning in a way they'll never forget. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll. Hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.